going to start by giving an overview of the mission. It's going to be very familiar to a lot of you, but for anybody who's new in here, it should be fun. And then we'll start talking at a high level about the GNC software architecture and doing a little bit of a dive into the specific flow, the data flow within those modules. And then Matthew and I are each going to present a sampling of the related research that we've done on this project so far. So for me, that's the reduced order modeling for spacecraft swarm orbit design. And Matthew has been working on closed form optimal solutions for propulsive differential drag control spacecraft swarms. Woo, that's a mouthful. And then briefly talking about a very exciting future project for this relating to relative accelerometry. Yes. Okay, so what is SwarmX? The Space Weather Atmospheric Reconfigurable Multiscale Experiment mission is a CubeSat, or it's 3 3U CubeSats operating in LEO, funded by NSF, and it came out of the NSF CubeSat Ideas Lab of 2019. Professor Miko attended. Actually, so did advisors as well, right? So, advisors also was from this same NSF CubeSat Ideas. Yeah, so that was a very exciting time for SLAB.
The two missions that have been funded.
Right. That was a very productive weekend.
1 week.
Oh, wow.
But I was almost there.
Well, thank you. It was paid off for us. So SwarmX is a 6 university partnership, and we here at SLAB are specifically responsible for the guidance, navigation, and control software payload. So SwarmX was conceived with a set of scientific objectives that are focused on these phenomena called the equatorial thermospheric and the equatorial ionization anomalies, or ETA and EIA. These are, this is a plasma density measurements taken by the CHAMP spacecraft, which was just a single small set back in 2015 or 16, I think. At any rate, so this is one-dimensional data because it was just a single spacecraft. But basically, around the equator, there are these very interesting features of the upper atmosphere, which are not very well understood, the way that they're formed or the way that they change in time and in space. And so SwarmX was conceived as a way to sort of advance what was done with a single spacecraft with CHAMP by instead introducing 3 spacecraft with variable baselines and also variable formation geometry, so that we can take measurements both in vertically in a long track sense. In addition to those scientific objectives, there's also a set of engineering objectives that are focused on advancing the state of the art in CubeSat swarming. So over the last couple of years, we've been going through the entire mission design process, and one of the very first steps you need to take is defining your objectives in a rigorous way. And so what we've done is defined our mission objectives as a set of primary science questions and a set of secondary measurement demonstrations. We then take those PSQs and SMDs and translate them into requirements that we can interpret as being like requirements on both the absolute and relative orbits. And so you can see this is just a sampling of, well, this is all the PSQs and SMDs, and then a sampling of how those are translated into orbit requirements. And so I'd like to highlight a couple of these here. This probably is a little hard for you guys to read. But basically, one of these PSQs has a requirement for a mean along track separation of 1,300 plus or minus 100 kilometers. And then another one down here, SMD4, requires a mean along track separation less than 10 kilometers, but with max radial separation greater than 10 kilometers in the target region. So these are obviously very difficult objectives to achieve, which is why they asked us to help. But the accomplishment of all of these very diverse objectives necessitates that we do multiple reconfigurations throughout the mission, in addition to long periods of simply maintaining our swarm configuration. And so this challenge specifically motivated the design or the development of the reduced order model, that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But to give you an idea of what the swarm mission looks like from a concept operations perspective, this is the full ConOps broken down. But essentially, following commissioning, there's a period during which we want to bring the spacecraft very close together so that we can perform an instrument cross-calibration of the Langmuir probes and the 5-pack sensors on board, which are directly measuring both neutral oxygen and also plasma in the upper atmosphere. So the spacecraft can be close for that. Then we have a period of a long separation where we increase the along-track separation to reach those 1,300 kilometer desired along-track separations in the target region. Then we take our measurements in the desired regimes. We bring our spacecraft close again to do a recalibration of the instruments. So this process happens twice, essentially throughout the mission duration. Is basically what it looks like, with some other minor changes in between to the other relative orbit geometries. Okay, these are our spacecraft. As I mentioned, 3U CubeSats. On the leading face here, there are 2 Langmuir probes and a 5X sensor is the large one. Each spacecraft is equipped with a 3D printed cold gas propulsion unit that we're getting from Georgia Tech. They all have full attitude control through a BCT Exact 15 ADCS system. Each individual spacecraft has a Nova Hill GPS receiver, which is its dual frequency L1, L2. We also have deployable UHF antennas on board, which are omnidirectional, and that's for both the inter-satellite link and also downlink. And we also have the ability to downlink data with an X-band antenna, which is specifically for the science data. Okay, so now diving into what is our piece of this specifically. So this is a figure depicting the high-level GNC architecture. Essentially, each spacecraft hosts an identical implementation of the GNC software on board, with the only variations in behavior coming from a role assignment that we send on ground. So a spacecraft is either the chief or it is one of the other 2 deputies, so that we have basically as much flexibility as possible to balance fuel, etc. All 3 spacecraft are exchanging both their own GPS measurements that they're receiving on board, as well as auxiliary data related to what they're doing in time and what control actions they're taking. Control is with respect, and the propulsive control is done with respect to a chief spacecraft, which can either be virtual, assigned to a reference orbit, or it can be attached to one of the individual spacecrafts. We also have the capability of performing differential drag, and I'll hop back to the spacecraft. So you see there's actually quite a large difference between what the maximum achievable cross-sectional area is and the minimum, right? So if we have the measurements, or the sensors into the RAM direction, it's only that 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter area versus the 90 centimeter by 90 centimeter, 30 by 30 with the solar panels. Okay. And now the GNC software architecture. So this is SWAG, the SwarmX Autonomous Guidance, Navigation, and Control. Essentially, there are 2 models. One is performing navigation or prediction. That's my principal responsibility. The other is control and collision avoidance, which is Matthew's piece. There are external interfaces with the ADCS, the GPS receiver, the inter-satellite link, propulsion, and then the larger CNDH architecture on board. Essentially, we are receiving these measurements, we're receiving attitude information, we're receiving information about maneuvers that are being performed in order to do our tasks. And specifically within navigation, we are estimating both absolute and relative states, and this is based on the exchange of position, velocity, and time measurements that we're receiving over the inter-satellite link. This is done in an unscented Kalman filter. As you recall, we have to vary the baseline between spacecraft to an extreme degree, and so at those large inter-spacecraft separations, a regular extended Kalman filter would perform very badly, we expect, and so that's the motivation for using an unscented Kalman filter. In addition to absolute and relative states, we're also estimating several other parameters by augmenting the state in order to, with measurements of atmospheric density and relative ballistic coefficients, so that we can better understand those atmospheric parameters and use them in our optimal hybrid control. Okay. And I'm going to turn over to Matthew for one slide, and then I'm going to come back.
So once Shane does all that and we get all the estimates, that's the majority of my inputs here is like inputs from navigation as far as the state goes. And then I also get some telecommands from ground as to like what the desired state is at the moment. And that can be based on whether we're formation keeping or we're trying to do reconfiguration, something like that. Control is basically initiated as long as it deviates this, or the estimated state is outside of an expected deviation. So that what that state is and where that tolerance is can just be set by ground and sent up to SwarmX to decide whether or not to conduct control. Once I actually have the state inputs and everything from navigation, I take them in, I figure out if I need to do maneuvers, and then I pass the variables to drag control and impulsive control or propulsive control. The impulsive control algorithms were the ones derived by Michelle, with some modifications that I've made to increase optimality for large changes in a long track separation. And then the drag control is the paper that I just wrote for Charlotte. The advantage of this, the thing that's really nice, is that optimal drag control is completely decoupled from the propulsive control. So both can be conducted optimally independently of one another. So if we just want drag control, we can just do drag control. If we just want propulsive control, we can just do that. We even have the ability to control a single plane of ROEs optimally by essentially just saying the other ROEs don't need to be controlled or don't need a deviation. Once that maneuver plan is created, it'll get sent to maneuver command handling. What we're currently planning on doing is housing the entire maneuver plan that we currently have internally and just sending essentially the next maneuver out to ADCS and out to propulsion so that they don't have to deal with the full maneuver plan. They're only getting one thing at a time. Yeah.
Okay, so now to dive into the reduced order model for spacecraft formal design, some of the work that I did to help in developing the ConOps for this mission. As I mentioned before, this was motivated by like the very challenging concept of operations we have for SwarmX. So the rest of the team was sort of asking me these very difficult questions like how much delta V is this going to cost, and like are these relative configurations going to be safe? And there wasn't really a very good way to give them a quantitative answer. A qualitative answer was simple. Yeah, I can say yes, these are safe. But to answer questions like how much delta V do we need for the full mission duration, we needed to develop something new because this didn't exist before. So running high fidelity simulations is nice, but especially if you're in early stages of mission development, doing repeated runs of high fidelity sims is very time constrained. Making small tweaks and then having to rerun just wasn't feasible. We needed something where we could get like a good answer that was very quick, that didn't necessarily need to be at the highest level of accuracy. And so our solution to this problem was to make a reduced order model to enable swarm orbit design in a manner that is sufficiently flexible to meet diverse mission requirements like for SwarmX, while providing reliable outputs for key mission design parameters. And so for us, those key mission design parameters that we initially made the reduced order model output were delta V consumption, minimum separations, and then maneuver timeliness. And so at the highest level, essentially, we have a set of inputs, a nominal configuration, desired control window sizes, time durations of maneuvers. We put them into our reduced order model, which consists of the three modules, a safety and collision avoidance module, swarm maintenance, and swarm reconfiguration modules. And this gives us outputs very, very quickly for minimum separation, delta V cost, the locations of maneuvers, and also how long those maneuvers require. I'm very limited on time here, so I'm only going to cover these two, and actually I may even cut that down a little because I think you guys have mostly seen this before. I will skip the definition of the ROE. Is that okay? Okay. And also the mapping to Cartesian. Just recall the equation for the minimum separation in a EI vector separated orbit. Okay, so diving into swarm reconfiguration, essentially we know from the gas variational equations how to express a change in ROE due to an instantaneous velocity increment in the RTN frame. These are obviously in-plane and out-of-plane motion is very conveniently decoupled. Note the block structure there. And so in the reduced order model, we use the delta V cost of maneuvers computed using the lower bound that Michel derived for reachable set theory. And so in the particular case of a long track reconfiguration, which is very important for SwarmX, there's two ways this can be achieved. In the simplest model, using propulsion, one impulsive maneuver introduces a difference in relative semi-major axis. There is a set time period of drift, and then that difference is corrected at a new long track separation, right? Which looks like this. So you're linear in a long track separation over time. Instead, using differential drag, of course, there's a trade where you're no longer consuming delta V, but now the question is how much time does it take to do, right? And that's a function of what the maximum differential ballistic coefficient you're able to introduce is. And so using differential drag, essentially, in a simple model, one spacecraft goes into a high drag mode. The relative semi-major axis begins increasing linearly. At some point, roughly halfway through the maneuver, they perform a switch where now the attitudes are different in the opposite sense, drifting back to zero. And this gives you this nice curve shape in the long track separation over time. And the nice thing about this simple model is that we can compute in a very straightforward way how much time this maneuver is going to take based on the size of the desired long track reconfiguration and knowledge about what is the differential ballistic coefficient we're able to introduce. I'll skip this as well. You guys are all very familiar with this. I'll just very quickly highlight that essentially the approach that the reduced order model takes to determining what is the worst case relative configuration. Essentially, you draw your control window bounds around your nominal EI vectors, and then consider first, is it possible to draw a 90-degree angle anywhere within those bounds? And if the answer is yes, of course, you know that there's a risk of conjunction. If the answer is no, then you proceed through this very straightforward algorithm and essentially find what is the worst case. And in this example, obviously the worst case is at the edges, at these edges, right? But it will always be at one of the extremes. Okay, and so now diving into some results. So we have a swarm reconfiguration scenario where we are increasing our launch track separation by 4 kilometers. In the propulsive case, within 16 orbits. And so running a large number of high fidelity simulations while sampling for navigation error and maneuver execution errors is going to produce a distribution of results. Instead, the reduced order model is producing a single result, but we want to make an apples to apples comparison. And so although we don't directly model navigation error, maneuver execution error in the reduced order model, we can mimic that behavior by sampling over a set of variables, which I think I'm going to get into a little bit more. Yeah, so basically, in the reduced order model, instead, we can sample over that time duration of the reconfiguration and what is the end state after reconfiguration to get another distribution. So the red distribution here is for high fidelity simulations, 500 of them, and the blue is from the reduced order model. And so what we see is, if you think about these ellipses as a covariance, what we see is that the diagonal terms, right, the means defining the actual size of the ellipses are essentially the same. There's only a slight difference in those off-diagonal terms, which results in this slight difference in sensitivity. Overall, comparing these two, we see errors on the level of 1% in maneuver magnitude and in time duration of reconfiguration, which is very good. This is exactly what we want to see. And so overall, what we're seeing here is that the reduced order model, in dramatically less time, is able to produce results that are broadly very similar to the best high fidelity sims that we can run in S-cubed, which is good. That's exactly what we want. And the same thing happens with swarm reconfiguration using differential drag. Instead, we have a histogram as a one-dimensional, but essentially what we perform the same reconfiguration using differential drag in both the high fidelity sims and in the reduced order model, and we see that we get an extremely similar distribution of results for how long this maneuver is going to take in time. And again, errors here are even smaller, on the order of less than 1%. Okay, and in a swarm maintenance scenario, essentially, we are maintaining a nominal set of ROE for a period of 100 orbits. In this case, we're sampling in the reduced order model for the size of the control window bounds, because of course it's possible for a maneuver to be executed slightly outside or slightly inside of the exact boundary, and also exactly how long the maintenance is going to be performed for. We generate our two distributions, and what we see here is instead that the off-diagonal terms are essentially identical, right? There's no relative tilt of the two error ellipsoids, but there's a slight variation in mean, meaning that the size of the ellipse is a little bit different. What this means, though, is that only a handful of individual runs of the reduced order model will fall outside of the 3 sigma bounds of our high-fidelity sims, which is good. This means that we have reliable results, especially considering that this is over a very long time period with many, many different maneuver cycles that can have compounding errors. We still get very good results from the reduced order model, on the order, again, of about 1 to 1.5% in delta V magnitude.
Cool. So the other major research topic that's motivated by SwarmX is the idea of hybrid control, which is the combination of differential drag control and propulsive control together. And this is primarily motivated by the needs of the mission, which is, as Shane mentioned, several large changes in the long track separation that occur over the course of the mission. And so differential drag is actually required for mission feasibility to have enough propulsion on board the spacecraft to conduct the other maneuvers they need to make. So because we have this desire to minimize fuel cost, and we also need maneuver planning to be conducted in closed form, it produced this question of like, well, can we do this optimally? And on the theory side, not only can we do it optimally, can we combine it with propulsive control and create this hybrid control for scenarios when we have a large reconfiguration, but mission constraints don't let us drift for as long as we need to. And so we need to add a little bit of propulsion to make sure we get to the desired state at a certain time. And so, as I said, the solution that is most of my research currently is a new hybrid formulation and closed form solutions of this optimal hybrid control problem. And this is the first ever application of really optimal differential drag control, but really optimal hybrid control in flight. First ever attempt at it. And down here, this is just kind of like a sanity check sort of thing of what differential drag looks like. It's literally, as Shane mentioned before, tilting one spacecraft with a higher cross-sectional area against the direction of travel than another, such you're creating a differential drag force in between two spacecraft in the formation. So you have a minimum drag state, intermediate, and maximum. And what this means is you can get a force, differential force, that occurs in either the positive or negative tangential direction for the spacecraft. Neat. Cool. So to accomplish this, differential drag is actually modeled as a control force on board the spacecraft, since the spacecraft can be controlling it due to the differential ballistic coefficient, which is the difference in their cross-sectional areas. Due to the fact that we can assume some things like relatively constant atmospheric density near circular orbit, we can actually analytically integrate the effect of this low thrust continuous maneuver over a time step and get an exact solution, such that we can almost approximate it as a series of impulsive maneuvers, come up with a linear time variant formulation, and use reachable set theory to analyze differential drag. And what reachable set theory comes up with is a set of 3 variations of optimal maneuver profiles. And these aren't the only optimal profiles that can be produced, but it's provable that these 3 profiles will be optimal for all of these dominance cases they're called, which is essentially the dimension of the state that dictates the minimum overall cost of a given reconfiguration or maneuver plan. So we have these 3 variations, and due to the delta V minimums that Michelle found in her work, we know how much each one of these profiles will affect the minimum cost of reconfiguration, and we can combine them optimally to come up with the lowest cost of reconfiguration. This is also what allows us to decouple this entire drag control from the impulsive control, because we know what the minimum impulsive cost will be. We don't have to solve for an impulsive maneuver plan to be able to find the optimal drag solution. And just as some quick results here, I kind of have a summary up here for the paper I did. There were a variety of reconfiguration options that were shown. Essentially what we're showing down here is that comparing a numerical solution of the hybrid control problem with the closed form solution, we get very similar control profiles and almost the exact same delta V minimums between the numerical solution and the closed form solution. And in all cases, the differential drag provides significant cost savings over an impulsive or propulsive only control approach. As you can see up here, it accomplishes in an ideal case, it accomplishes the along track reconfiguration with a very similar accuracy as the impulsive control methodology on its own. So we've shown that it can provide consistent cost savings. The closed form approach will fully solve optimal hybrid control. And it's reliably realizable on physical hardware. Oftentimes with a number of variables this large, just plugging this into CVX, it doesn't solve. And we know that the closed form solution will always solve. So there's that also enhanced reliability that's desirable for spaceflight.
So to wrap up, we've talked about the work that we've done so far. So what's the next step? Well, after we both finish writing the actual flight software, which we're working on right now, there is this very interesting experiment that we're doing. This is SMB4, which is relative accelerometry. And essentially the idea is we use the spacecraft themselves as a distributed aeronomy sensor, aeronomy being the science of the upper atmosphere. So the way that this works is by deliberately modulating the spacecraft attitudes, we increase the differential ballistic coefficient and therefore increase the sensitivity of the spacecraft relative motion to the atmosphere, the environment that it's seeing in the atmosphere, specifically the mass density. And so what we're showing here on the right is a proof of concept where in the model, this sinusoidal behavior is both long-term and short-term. It's introduced into the atmospheric density that's being used within the simulation environment. And then by measuring the relative acceleration, relative velocity, relative position, you can see their sensitivities to this sort of unnatural atmospheric density. And essentially what we're seeing is that in the relative acceleration, this is mimicked, exactly, right? So the relative acceleration of the spacecraft is sensitive to this, we're talking about 10 to the minus 12 scale difference in relative, or in atmospheric density. So then the idea is that we downlink our raw GNSS measurements and we perform a very precise post facto estimation of both the relative orbits and our desired atmospheric parameters, particularly mass density. This will, of course, be based on the digital framework and will rely very heavily on integer ambiguity resolution through the use of these raw GNSS pseudo-range and carrier phase measurements. And there are a couple of different ideas also that we haven't yet investigated, but which merit further investigation about how this can be done and what specifically we should be estimating alongside our relative motion. And one of those is we have these very accurate measurements that we're taking in situ of atomic or of neutral oxygen, which is the dominant species in that region of the upper atmosphere. And so the idea is that we can use our measurement of the individual oxygen atoms hitting our 5-pack sensor as a proxy for mass density, and then estimate that alongside. I think this is it for us, besides some backup if anyone has questions. Yep. So we're happy to take any questions.